Good morning, and welcome to this virtual space. I can see you all floating around me. I'm Paul Bowman. I'm Head of Film Culture at Film London. I'm delighted to welcome you to this online version of Film London's Exhibitors Breakfast. Thanks to all the Film Hub London members that joined us today. Thanks to all the fan members from across the UK that have joined us. I hope you're all doing well. Before we start, just to say a quick thanks to BFI and National Lottery, without whose support none of this would be possible. Today we're going to focus on grant fundraising, and I'm delighted to welcome fundraising consultant Ellen McGuiness to run today's workshop and guide us through. We'll cover how the pandemic has affected grant fundraising and the type of grants there are out there, as well as the practicalities of funding research, communicating your vision, and proposal writing. As there will be some discussions in smaller groups, it would be great if you could join one of the tables floating around, which are the purple dots that say hover, then click and join. If you could join one of those, that would be great. If there could be 2 or 3 people per table, that would be perfect. A minimum of 2, so you've got someone to talk to. Yeah, that would be fab. In a minute, I'll hand over to Ellen. If you do have any questions as we go along, please do pop them in the chat, and we'll aim to get to them in the Q&A at the end. And to save your scribbles, we will be circulating Ellen's deck at the end of the breakfast, after the breakfast. We'll also have 30 minutes networking at the end of the workshop in this toucan virtual space, where you just click on the person you are looking to talk to, and then you will join them. We've got lots to get through, so I am going to hand over to Ellen. Ellen, do you want to join me here on the virtual stage? Wonderful. Hi, Ellen.
Hi, hello everyone.
Hey, okay, Ellen, over to you.
Great. Yeah, hi everyone. I hope you're all well today. Thanks for coming along. I'm just going to load up my presentation. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I was just going to just put this in a little bit of context before I start, which is that I'm doing these sessions across the hub, across all the regions of the hub. So the idea is obviously to give you as much some kind of advice about grant fundraising, but following on from this, we're also going to be producing some kind of central resources on grant fundraising, covering things like budgets, some of the things I'm discussing in a bit more detail. But I just wanted to flag that if there's anything in particular resource-wise that you think would be useful for your fundraising, then if you could either let us know in the chat today, or if you think of something after this session, kind of email Steffi and Paul and just let them know. I just want to make sure that we include everything that you need, basically. So I'm just going to start with an introduction of today. So we're going to start, the presentation bit itself is split into 2, and then we're going to have this kind of session work in the breakout groups in the middle that Paul mentioned. So the first section is articulating the vision, and that's really just how you tell the story of what you're raising funds for. The second part is, I hope all of you got the pre-session questions and had a chance to have a look at those. Don't worry too much if you didn't. You'll definitely have time to discuss those. We're going to take about 15 minutes in the middle to have a kind of a little discussion in your groups. And then the second part of the presentation is the more practical stuff. So the research, where to find funders, approaching budgets, those types of things. And yeah, and then at the end, as Paul was saying, if you want to drop your questions into the Q&A, we're going to be, we'll take them, as many of them as we can at the end. So yeah, that's where we are now. So as I said, this first bit is about articulating the vision. And this is a really critical thing for fundraising, but it's also important, it's a core piece of organizational development work. And I think one of the things to think about is sometimes fundraising gets pushed to the side slightly, so as if it's a separate thing to who you are as a core organisation, and it kind of comes up when you're applying for fundraising, rather than this central messaging about how you actually define who you are and what it is you want to achieve. The main thing to think about here is that if you can't articulate what you are and what you're doing, who you're working with and why, then you're not ready for fundraising. And often that is when organisations struggle, is they're trying to answer some of these questions, but they haven't answered the more key questions before that. And this is essential to all fundraising, I mean, as well as your organisational kind of development. But so if your grants, community fundraising, corporate support, individuals, you know, stories that you have on your website, those types of things, you really need to understand who you are and what you're doing. And the great way to do this, and I suggest this with kind of everything you're doing, is to start, oh, sorry, no, I totally forgot about this slide. Types of project as well. So before we move on, I was going to say we're going to move on to
because I'm at a table
and
now.
this is basically a central document where you can answer all the questions that you might come across in fundraising applications, but also things that you do need to know about what you're doing. So within that, you may find that you need more than one case for support. A case for support, which is about your core organisational work, but also for specific projects, especially if you are, as I say, seeking funding for them. And I've put on the board here just a few examples of the types of project that might include basically. So cultural funding is one area. So certainly there are options out there. Japanese is always a good example, because there are quite a lot of Japanese cultural foundations in this country. But, you know, just thinking about if you've got a specific angle, that there may well be funders that are not necessarily specifically about film, but may be interested in, you know, the culture of their country. Community engagement and audience development, obviously they overlap quite a lot, but there's also obviously quite a lot of difference as well. But just thinking about, you know, those as separate but also intertwined activity. Cross arts and new music commissions are quite interesting as well, because they can broaden the type of funders you can go to in terms of funding for activity. A lot of funders not necessarily understanding of film. So actually when you have additional activity, so maybe workshops inspired by a film that you're screening in another kind of arts media, creative kind of activity, that might be of interest to other types of funders, thinking about the Arts Council in particular here, and also new music commissions. And obviously this is particularly related to, tends to be film heritage and silent films, and kind of live events around that with new music commissions. Education as well, obviously, is a separate area where certainly if you were looking at either kind of formally working with schools or more relaxed kind of community education, you might, again, you probably need a separate case for support for that. And I've just put capital work on here. I mean, I'm not sure today how many of you are venues, but obviously it's a very specific different area. It does cover things like equipment, but the main focus tends to be on bricks and mortar. And then just to flag really that the other thing to be focusing on and thinking about is national anniversaries. They're, you know, being aware of what's coming up and what opportunities that might give you. Often, you know, you're probably thinking about this in terms of your programming as well. But, you know, just thinking about what's out there and what opportunities that might be. I mean, the recent example is the World War I projects and all the funding there's been around that area. I should have said this at the beginning, but I'm just going to say that I'm not sure what level everybody's experience of fundraising is. So I apologise if I'm kind of pitching, you know, pitching below for some of you, and you already know what I'm talking about. And additionally, I am going to be covering quite a lot. And as Paul was saying, I'm going to share the slides. So, you know, if there is anything that you're slightly confused about, or you know, I'm throwing too much information at you, then obviously don't be afraid. Please do ask questions at the end, and I say we'll share the presentation as well. So moving on to the case for support. So this is a really, really helpful document. I don't do any fundraising without my case for support as the first document. Effectively you start with a template document, and as I say, you know, it's cool to have one for your organization, but certainly for the projects, and sometimes you'll find the projects are overlapping, so they don't need one each, but if they're quite distinct projects, it's very good process to go through to really understand what it is you're trying to do. And why. So the key kind of questions are, you know, what are you trying to achieve, and what you'll actually be doing. So, you know, the activity you're planning and what you expect to get out of that, basically. But then also why. I mean, this is often the bit that gets missed out, because you can be very clear in understanding what you want to do, but articulating you know, really telling your story about why you want to do it is such an important thing to kind of pull people in. And I think, you know, in terms of this section, it is useful to think about this as storytelling. You know, it's like any story. You want to bring your audience with you. You want to engage them with what you're saying. You want them to get excited. You want them to feel, you know, emotions about certain things. You want them to connect with what you're saying. So you need to be clear, but you do need to kind of think about what brings people in.
And then you see
so the next part of that is, you know,
media.
What is the best way to do what you're talking about? So you may have modules that you've used already, or something that you'd like to try for various reasons.
Yes,
perhaps
there we
piloted,
go. Paul,
but it's just making sure that you're really clear as to why you've chosen the approach you have.
That is perfect.
The when will you do it? I mean, this
so
sounds like a really obvious thing, but in terms of timelines, just remembering to include your planning time as well, and not to, you know, not to be tempted to start your timelines with your activity, and just make sure you give yourself enough time. And you know, if you're applying for grant funding, that you're actually funding yourself for that prep time as well, as much as possible. The why you is another vitally important part of this. So telling the story of your organization, really, and again, I think it does help to think about that as a story as well. You know, where you came from, who you are, what expertise you have, what experience you have. And I think what's very nice about the case for support is that obviously in many application forms you have word counts and you have to be selective about what you can include, but if you do your case for support, you can kind of put everything in that you think is relevant, and then you have this central document that when you come to it, when you're actually doing the application, you can just pull out the relevant bits. And yeah, absolutely, it won't all be relevant for everything, but when you're actually doing applications, you've done all the work at the beginning. So you are limiting, you know, the actual resource you need to put into the application. How does it look for you? Of course, you will have to tailor what you're doing, and obviously answer specific questions, but it's a lot less work if you've already got this kind of vision behind you and know what you're doing. The other part of this is understanding the need you're trying to meet, and this is particularly important in grant fundraising, because grant fundraising is so focused on, you know, the impact you're having on your audiences, beneficiaries, the people you work with. So understanding why you think they should be engaged in the first place is just so important. And then later on in the second part of the session, I've got some slides about tips for finding that kind of contextual information that you might need to demonstrate what you're saying, basically, the evidence, basically. And then, of course, talking about the impact. So once you've worked out what the need is, how are you going to change people's experiences? What impact are you going to have on them? So those two obviously very tied together, but you know, effectively these are your most of your case for support. I've pulled out the area which is about who are you going to work with, because this is so important, as I was saying, in terms of the impact. But you need, you know, there's kind of quite a few separate questions you need to ask about how you're going to have to keep an eye on this, or other beneficiaries. If you're doing creative work, sharing, and it said stop kind of sharing skills development, that type of thing as well. I just assumed you could see it. So really knowing who your audiences are now, who you're currently working with, and who you want them to be. There's nothing wrong with your audience staying the same and just making them, the other day, you know, well, keeping going with them if you have good numbers, or you know, extending the numbers that you're reaching with. But equally, obviously, here on my side, the drive is to reach as many underrepresented audiences as possible. So it's just really understanding who you're reaching.
That would be where we
who
then
you're not
break out
reaching,
into the little groups.
and just being very clear about that, and understanding how you know that as well. You know, what type of information do you collect on your audiences, and then also why. So as well as, you know, understanding, this kind of goes back again to the kind of need and the impact question from before, but why do you want to work with these people? Why do you think they would benefit from being involved in your work? And this is the bit where you're kind of flipping it around a bit. So, you know, it's obviously you want to take the work with as many people as possible.
Let me try again. Does it move now?
They might get out of it as well. And one of the areas in recent years that's kind of grown, and it's grown out particularly
I think what it is,
the National Lottery Community Fund,
I think what it is that when I have it in slideshow mode,
really being
it's not
engaged with the people
but when I've
that you're
just got it
working
in
with, so
3D
that you're talking
it's
to them and you
for
can
me,
really understand what they want and need. And there's definitely a drive, and it's been picked up in a lot of the bigger funders, your Esme Fairbairn, Paul Hamlin in particular as well. They've both revised their criteria over the last year, much more focus on, you know, the fact that your projects are community led, and that they are helping to design projects, deliver them and evaluate them. So it's just thinking about those, who you're talking to, and if you're not talking to these people, how do you talk to them? And the most obvious thing here is talking about partners. And I'll be talking a bit more about partners a bit later, but just, you know, you have a very focused area of work. Probably the easiest way and the most effective way to work with different groups is to work with partners. And then again, if you're having this closer relationship with people, and I'm sure some of you already do, then actually you have a much better way to a clearer understanding of the impact on them, because they can tell you directly. You can get some great case studies, and you just have a much closer relationship. So within this context, obviously, you know, the pandemic there has been an impact on grants. And some of it is not a massive change on the kind of focus that's been there in the arts funding in particular, in terms of, you know, underrepresented and disadvantaged groups. But the focus here is now on people who've been most impacted. So yeah, different ethnic groups, but also obviously the poorer people in particular. I was to say people who probably weren't necessarily engaging overall before, you know, the kind of disposable income obviously has gone down for a lot of people. So just bearing in mind that, you know, a lot of funders are still focusing on that. Most funders have reopened. Some are still kind of half open, and a lot of them are just completely overwhelmed. So just bear that in mind, that the closer you can get to the criteria that they have now, the more chance of success you have. And also that applications are just taking a lot longer. Everybody is overwhelmed by the demand now that things are opening up again. So the other thing within this is the grassroots are being valued. So certainly for the smaller organisations amongst you, and from what I understand, I think quite a lot of you are pretty small. Actually, you know, this is who you are. You have this kind of grassroots reach into your communities, but also into the groups you work with. So just don't be afraid to shout about that, who you are, and that, you know, you're kind of close links with that. And then the other part of this, which links with grassroots, but community also in the sense of bringing communities together. So serving underserved communities, but also just, you know, bringing everybody back together again, basically. And just picking up on the partnership theme again, there's definitely, you know, value for money is obviously important. There's a lot more demand, as I was saying. So working together is something that most funders are looking favourably on. So from this, I'm just going to show you, this is a word cloud that's been compiled by Grants Online. And they kind of do, they're a database, they do research, all those type of things. But recently they've created this word cloud, which I thought I'd share with you because it's quite interesting. It's about basically the words that are being used a lot in applications at the moment. And just, I suppose, focusing on what I was just saying, you know, the big word here is community. It's not really surprising, but it's just interesting to see it in this way. And obviously, like, yes, children, young people, health, justice and welfare, but, you know, the arts and culture are up there as well. And I think, you know, they are responding to need. And there is definitely an awareness probably more of an awareness than before in some ways, that, you know, there are a lot of freelance creatives who have really struggled through the pandemic in particular. So yeah, so just useful to kind of see it in that way. So the other thing, this kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, but in terms of your case for support, what's really important is that messaging, yes, you can then use it for fundraising, but it's not just about fundraising. And fundraising, as I was saying, should not happen in isolation. It's about that messaging that story in so many different places. So your public profile, if you know you're actively trying to fundraise and raise funds, you need to let people know. So you might have nice case studies that maybe you're only sharing in reports. You know, put those type of things on your website as well, so that people can see the other work you do, the wider benefit of the activity you're doing, the impact that you have on people. All those kind of, even just like the nice little quotes you get from people, maybe in emails and things. That it's just finding ways to share those, basically. But your case for support as well, that kind of messaging about who you are and what you do is so central that all your staff need to know about it, basically. So they need to understand, and especially public facing, they need to understand what you're doing, and what what your projects are coming up, what other things you might be doing, because anybody could be a potential donor. Obviously, we're very much focusing here on grant fundraising, but, you know, from your small kind of people who might be considering the opportunity of you know, making a small donation, to, you know, anybody could be a potential major donor. You just don't know. I mean, that's the key thing to just be aware of, really. The other thing is that when you're applying for grant fundraising, donors look at websites. You know, foundations, they will look at your website and see what you're doing. And often websites have you have very much focus potentially on you know, what you're doing as I was saying, in terms of your activity and your screenings and those types of things. And that is all great, but if you can just add a little bit more about the wider context, it just shows, you know, that the stuff you're talking about in the application is not completely separate to your kind of public facing work. And kind of related to that, this question of actively fundraising, is, do you have a donate now button and capacity on your website? And do you ask for people? I think, you know, there's nothing wrong with having a message, whether it's on your email or kind of, you know, across a banner on your website. It doesn't necessarily need to be there all the time, but it's just something saying, you know, actually reminding people that, you know, you're a not-for-profit and you need support, and that, you know, you're grateful for support. You know, you can work on your messaging. It doesn't have to be, you know, straight out, you know, we're desperate or anything. But just thinking about how all of this stuff combines and articulates your vision in a way that just makes it really clear why you need support, and that, you know, that you're worth supporting. So building on that, I'm just going to briefly go over partnerships.
Am I presenting?
It kind of straggles the articulating the vision and the kind of practical grant skills.
Fine.
But I think it's worth talking about now, because it is a part of the case for support process as well. Is thinking about that question about whether you need to work with partners basically to extend your reach.
I would like to get,
and you know, these are the types of reasons you will. Extending your reach, absolutely. You know, you don't want to start duplicating work that's already happening in your community.
Okay, I'm going to
so really understanding who is around you, and what they're all doing, is, you know, really, really important. And as I say, I'm sure some of you are doing that already. And the other thing is obviously the expertise that brings, especially if you're working with particular groups you might not have worked with before. You know, actually working with people who have a real understanding of that is obviously a massive benefit. Again, it is about utilising resources and avoiding duplication. And this is for you as organisations, but also from a funding point of view. If you've got a local funder who's interested in particular issues, then they're also going to be, you know, potentially getting applications from similar organisations. They'll be aware of what is going on more broadly. And if you're not, then that, you know, that will reflect negatively on you. You don't want to kind of end up potentially applying at the same time with a project that is very similar to something going on locally, because, you know, they're not going to fund both. But also it just kind of raises your game. It shows that you're aware of what's going on in your community. And yeah, just generally it leads to more effective projects and increases your impact. So it is a really important thing to think about. And just here I say this is the more practical side, but finding partnerships, and I think it's just thinking about this all the time. I mean, at the end of obviously today's session, there is going to be some networking, but it's just looking at all kind of networking opportunities, really. You know, other cinemas and art venues are the obvious ones, but also looking at local charities, kind of local branches of national charities that are working in your area, artists, filmmakers and other creatives. And part of this is because, you know, obviously a lot of these creatives are freelancers, and many of them will actually have quite a lot of experience in working, doing, you know, kind of workshops and things, because, you know, it's the other side of how they pay their bills and work creatively. So it's just not forgetting that there are many people out there who are working independently who you might be able to work with as well. And then more broadly, fundraising networks are quite a good option as well. The Institute for Fundraising has networks across the country. You do have to be a member, but for low-level incomes, the annual membership is quite low. But it just means that you get access to local groups of fundraisers, and some of those will be professional fundraisers, but some will be people who are doing fundraising and yeah, project management, all those types of things. And what it is often they just meet, you know, semi-regularly, and it's so that other support networks as well, and they know what's going on with fundraising, with funders. So it's definitely worth seeing if there are any networks that you think you could be part of. And as I say, some of those are at quite local level as well, or potentially, you know, setting up your own if there are groups, you know, within the hub who are doing fundraising. It may be, you know, that it's worth investigating whether it's worth, you know, meeting, I don't know, every couple of months just to catch up and reassure each other as well, know what's going on overall. But just, you know, fundraising can be frustrating, you know, I think we all know that. So sometimes it's just good to have a network which is just about that aspect of what you're doing. Okay, so that's the end of the first part of the session. So what I think, hoping that you're all on your tables, but if you're not, if you could make sure that you're in tables, I think of no more than 3, because we want a chance for you all to have a say, really, but 2 is also fine. And these are the 3 questions that we sent out before, and we're not going to ask you to feed back to the group, so don't worry at all about you know, sharing or those type of things. This is just for you to kind of think about and have a little bit of a discussion on your table, basically. I mean, all 3 questions are you know, interesting, and certainly the first 2, I think, you know, if you answered them honestly to yourself, it would be, you know, that's a really good process for yourself anyway, to understand what those barriers are, if there are any. So I think it would be good to maybe just talk about them in the general terms. And the third one, in some ways, is the one it would be good for you to talk about as a group. So what you thought before you came, and potentially whether you've had any other ideas about how you might refine that so far, or yeah. So just really, yeah, if you want to have a chat about how you might do that, basically. And we're going to give you 15 minutes. So I'm going to leave the session now, stop presenting, and then when the 15 minutes is over, we'll give you a note in the chat about 5 minutes before to give you a notice, and then I'll just pop back up at the end of those sessions. So, all right, I'll see you soon. And yeah, so now we're going to move on to the practical grant skills. So hopefully you've articulated your vision, you've got your case for support, you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and now, yeah, you're basically focused on finding those funders, the evidence you need, and all the kind of practical stuff. So I'm just going to start. I mean, I'm sure that, you know, most of you are aware of this, but it just feels like a good time to go over the different types of funding, really. So in terms of when we're talking about grant funding, we tend to be talking about applying to charitable trusts and foundations, which can range from, you know, very large professionally run organisations with lots of staff to much smaller, kind of potentially run by an individual, where, you know, they may meet once a year, might not actually have staff. So a much more ad hoc process. So all of them, you know, well, not all of them. I mean, there are some obviously that are not open for applications and seek out their own funding partners, but those that are would still, on the whole, want the same kind of information. Then we're obviously talking about public sector and local authority, obviously a lot of overlap, but just kind of dividing it up into the more national opportunities through, you know, DCMS or the town fund, all the kind of different things across different areas of government that might be available. And again, you know, your kind of local authority grants. I mean, the main thing here is that the last two grants are far more likely to be contracts, where there's probably less room to negotiate. If you have an underspend, you're more likely to have to give money back, although that can be the case with charitable trusts and foundations as well, but they tend to be, as long as you're still doing your project, you might be able to negotiate a bit more around what you're doing. And then the two main types of grants really are your unrestricted and your restricted grants. Unrestricted is kind of like the holy grail, it's what you really want. But mostly it's restricted funding, which means that you have to spend it on a specific project or activity that you've applied for. And then, yeah, beyond that, it's the type of activity you're applying for. So revenue grants or project grants. And project grants could be divided into capital and non-capital. But on the whole, you know, some funders fund everything. Some are very much only focused on project funding. In fact, quite a lot prefer project funding. And some, those kind of revenue core costs, they're very, you know, they will support those as well. The key thing to remember is that when you're doing your project funding is to make sure you do factor in some overheads and extra staff time. So yes, I'm going to go through the kind of main stages of grant fundraising. Really, you want to start with you've started with your case for support, basically, you've got that document, but then you want to start with your research. I'm going to go into that in a bit more detail in a minute. Cultivation, so building those relationships with your funders. You need to have a really clear understanding of who they are, where they are, and how you might get to know them, basically. The actual application process itself, how you go about filling in those forms, your reporting and monitoring, and then the stewardship. So you've got your funder, but actually, how do you keep them on board? How do you keep them happy? How do you encourage them to give again? So in terms of research, there are two main areas, and this is can be broken down into the funder research and the wider context research, which I talked about earlier. I'm going to start by talking through the funder research. So as I'm sure you know, that there are many different ways that you can look for funders. The most commonly known is around databases, and we're going to talk about those in a minute, and those kind of search functions. But also it's just, again, this kind of building partnerships in your local community. So one, being aware of who is funding organisations that do the type of work you do. Now, not every website has their supporters listed on their website, but when they do, you know, they will often have a thank you, especially to the trusts and foundations. And, you know, there may well be names there you don't know, but at least you know you're starting with an organisation that is already supporting projects that are similar to yours. So that's always a very good place to start. And, you know, as a professional fundraiser, I'm the type of person who's always looking for the donor board in public spaces and taking photos and checking who's on those lists. So it's just kind of thinking about these things when you're out and about. Funding newsletters is another great place to look at this as well. There are a lot of different, some smaller organisations, some quite locally community-based that you might be able to find in your area. But generally, I've put a couple of suggestions on here. So Grants Online has a particularly good weekly email that it sends out with grant opportunities, and it lists them where you are and coming up with deadlines. To access all of the information on their website, you need to be a subscriber. But you know, you've got the top line, so you can go to the actual website of the funder to find out more details. Funding Scotland might seem like a strange one to have on here, but they actually have a really good national funding list as well. So every week they send out Scottish funding opportunities, but also national funders who fund across the UK. Not everything will be relevant, but in my mind, it's one of the most detailed mail outs that goes out. Obviously, it won't have London specific funders, but it's certainly a great one to see again what's coming up, and keep an eye on that. And in London, I find the London Community Foundation is a pretty good place to start in terms of their mail outs for the funding options that they, the grant schemes that they run themselves on behalf of different trusts and organisations, but also they tend to be quite good at keeping people in the loop on what else is going on and other opportunities. So yeah, so it's just, you know, when you have an opportunity to sign up to something that looks like it might have a funding newsletter, and perhaps, you know, you want to set it up so it goes into a folder straight away, so you're not, you know, being overwhelmed by these emails, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye out, because even, like, you know, those of us who are professional fundraisers, you can miss funding application deadlines until they're quite late if they're not on your radar, and it does introduce you to funds that you might not be aware of. So yeah, so as I was saying, if you're then sitting down, so less of the kind of what's out there, and just seeing what comes into your inbox, there are a lot of databases out there which have a lot of information. I put a few of these on there. There are others, and really, you know, some of these are free, some of them aren't, and it's really down to personal choice. The 360 Giving is a free website, and it actually has quite a lot of wider data about where charities are actually giving their money. So if they say they support, I don't know, the arts, the homeless, and the environment, you can actually see the division, and they have, like, you know, nice pie charts and all that kind of thing. Unfortunately, not everybody is on there, but it's always worth having a look, because it does give a good overview of what charities are actually, grant makers are actually doing. Funds Online and the DCS, this is actually quite a it's quite an expensive database to use, but being in London, certainly not at the moment, but, you know, as things start to reopen again, their main offices are in Holloway Road, and at their offices you can book in to make an appointment and access the databases for free. And they also have a library of lots of other types of, I mean, the Directory of Grant Making Trusts, which is basically the grant making Bible, which is published every year, and which you can, I mean, all the information on the database is there as well. I personally use the book quite a lot. But again, you can get it from libraries. Westminster Library always has a copy of that as well. But it's just, and actually the BFI library has a copy of the Directory of Grant Making Trusts every year. So yeah, it's just, you know, in London you do have some options to access those for free. The charity commissions always say a good one to look at. They have so effectively they do have a charity search. It's not the most sophisticated, but it's a good way, you know, if you're just checking, you know, looking out for a local area, because you can search, you can really define your location, but you just need to make sure that you tick the box that says grant making trust, otherwise you'll just come up with all the charities in that area. And then I'm just going to mention Grants Online again, and actually Grant Finder. I'm quite a fan of Grants Online because you can subscribe on a monthly basis, you know, much cheaper level, but they cover all grants, so all your public sector, local authority giving is on there as well. So it's a really good kind of thing for everything. But to be honest, DCS does that as well. I've talked particularly there about Funds Online, but I'd say they do corporate giving, they do everything across the board. So, you know, well worth checking out the Directory of Social Change. So then the other kind of research I was talking about is this wider context. So when you're talking about defining the need in your area, I'm going to assume it's an area at this point, and it could be an area which is a place, but it could also be, you know, a specific community that you're interested in working in, and you're trying to talk about where you're working and how that relates to that demographic. So these are some kind of potential national places you can look for reports and stats. So the Runnymede Trust is always a good place to look in terms of the race equality figures. Their current publications cover all sorts of things, and they. I mean, this can be quite overwhelming, and certainly it's one of the things that, in terms of resources, we're thinking about is how we might be able to do a resource which kind of is a guide to, you know, not necessarily having to read everything and how to bring what you need out of these documents. But effectively, you want to read the synopsis to have a clearer understanding of what you're doing. Joseph Rowntree Foundation, certainly, in terms of everything to do with poverty and social change, they're always great for all their reports and stats as well. The government's deprivation indices, which were last updated in 2019, they kind of do those every 4 or 5 years, where you can look by borough, by postcode. You can also see where you are relates to the national. So where areas rank basically in terms of deprivation, and that uses all the kind of statistics around free school meals, benefits, unemployment, all those types of things. And similarly, the Office for National Statistics, just in terms of your local demographic, that's a really good place to start. But in terms of the more London focus, particularly around this group, the Trust for London is also very good. They do London's poverty profile every year. So they have great data links on their website that are really actually very easy to use and understand. So definitely recommend them. And they again have a lot of publications related to that area that might be useful. The Mayor of London and the London Assembly, of course, as well. They have a lot of data resources around well, everything really, who everybody is in London. So yeah, absolutely use those resources. And borough councils, of course, as well. I've included the link there from the Mayor of London website, because effectively you can search then into each borough council basically. And although NOMUS is the kind of national official labour market statistics, I've included the link here because it's very much again about searching by where you are. And then this is the kind of arts engagement need, so demonstrating where the gaps in provision are here, basically. And I mean, that any of these are a surprise to you, but yeah, so obviously the Arts Council, along with DCMS, do the Taking Part survey most years, and again, they have all the results on their website, and that is split down by age, by types of activity and the level of engagement. So whether that's very little to none to quite a lot of engagement. Obviously the BFI also, all their kind of data insights and reports across the industry obviously includes audiences, but some of the wider issues that you might be engaging with around environmental sustainability, accessibility, those types of things. And of course, in terms of accessibility, inclusive cinema, they have some great data sets on their website as well that you can use and use as evidence. The other thing to think about is the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Similarly to the Arts Council, they have a lot of research and insight into engagement with heritage and culture. And certainly depending on the type of project you're working on, that might be quite useful for you as well. Certainly worth looking at what figures they're collecting at any one time. So moving on from research, the next stage is about cultivation. So this is thinking about how you build those relationships really. Sometimes grant funding, and this is slightly different with kind of public sector, to be honest, but it's helpful to think of charitable trusts and foundations as the individuals behind them. Not all of them will let you get to know them before you have funds, but some will. And when you have the opportunity to speak to people, you just need to think of those as opportunities to build relationships and get to know people, and take them when you can, basically. But you can do that in many ways, obviously, kind of, as I say, asking for advice if you're going to put in the application, but also inviting organisations and people from organisations that you think will be interested in what you're doing to events. Don't be afraid to invite people. If they don't want them, they'll tell you. And again, on a more local level, potentially local authority or local funders, and there are a lot of obviously borough specific funders. If there's something particular that you are doing or an achievement that you want to share, it is quite nice to kind of, use that as an excuse to contact, local organisations, or as I say, people in local government, and just say, look, I just want you to hear what we're doing, just about raising your profile, basically. And social media, the same way, as I was saying earlier about the case for support, obviously raising the profile of your charity work generally, but also worth following some of these big funders. One, you'll get an idea, well, not just the big funders, to be honest, the local funders who might be relevant to you as well. You'll know what they're doing. You'll kind of have an idea of the type of projects they support. And also just that wider kind of cultural, engagement in your local area can grow from that as well. And generally, I mean, I talked a bit earlier about networks, but obviously, yeah, when you have opportunities to go to things where you might be able to meet funders, or they might be in the room, it's definitely worth, trying to do that as well. So moving on to applying for funding, there are some key rules. I mean, obviously we've covered the case for support and kind of what hopefully you'll be writing, but number one is make sure you're eligible. And I mean, it sounds a really silly thing to say, but it's estimated that between 60 and 70% of all applications received by grant makers are not eligible for the funds that they have been sent to. So it's just worth being doubly sure. And, and if you're not sure, then try and contact them and ask. Sometimes you will get funders who, there are funders out there who don't engage very much, and you will look like you have met all their criteria, and they will come back and say to you, you're not eligible. And unfortunately, there's nothing you can do about that. I mean, it's the way of the world sometimes, that there just seem to be some charitable trusts and foundations, and you can't work out at all why you weren't eligible. But obviously, make sure that you are. So applying good time, this is always the thing you really need to remember, is the average application process for a grant is 6 months plus. And actually at the moment, with all the delays, we're probably talking more like 8 months. So just factor that in, because most funders won't fund any work that's taken place before the grant is granted. So yeah, you just need to kind of, and this is where having a case for support helps, because you've got your central document. So hopefully you're planning in advance, you know what you're doing, and you're not, it's really about not just being reactive, and hopefully anticipating and being able to plan what you can apply for. The other side of this is not being funder led. So you definitely want to tailor your case for support. You don't start with the application form, you use your case for support. But if you find that you're being dragged off in a direction that you don't really want to go in, then don't, step back and go, actually, is this what we want to do? And that's another reason why kind of a core case for support is useful, because if you're suddenly finding yourself developing something with a funder that's got no relation to any of those documents that you've all kind of signed up to, that's a real warning sign that you're going off somewhere else. And yeah, I was saying all of this helps you to be prepared, and just remember to read and use the guidance. I mean, I tend to, when I'm doing an application, the first thing I do, if the guidance is not already in the application form, is drop the guidance that's relevant to each question into my draft under each question. Just helps to keep you on track. And that's what the guidance is there for. I mean, that's the thing to remember, it's all there to help you. So when you're actually writing that application, so clear and concise, short sentences, and no jargon. I think it helps to think of the kind of the plain English mantra, short sentences are easier to follow. There's no room for confusion. And the simpler the language you use, then the clearer it is. And also don't assume knowledge of your sector. I mean, I think we all do it quite a lot. We end up in our bubbles, especially like in the film world, we do have a lot of things that we all take for granted, that we all know what we're talking about. Especially with funders, you need to assume that, it's very unlikely they're going to know a lot about the sector at all. So just make sure you're thinking about that. And in terms of the criteria of a fund, it's very helpful to think about how and this is where putting the guidance into the questions can really help, because you can pull out kind of certain words. And sometimes it's about mirroring the language directly. Sometimes it's like using similar words to kind of get the same effect. But it's really thinking about, if they're talking about exciting, innovative work, that you show with your language how what you're doing meets those criteria. Answer the question. Now, this may sound like a slightly silly thing to put in here, but it's very easy, especially if you're not kind of constantly reflecting on the question and the guidance for that question, to kind of spend time putting some information in from your case for support and not really doing anything else with it. So you've got information that is vaguely related to the question, but you've not directly actually answered the question. So always just reread. And I would do this, the next day, go away from your application for a while, and then you can be really honest with yourself and say, actually, I don't think I have answered that question. And likewise, getting it read by someone outside your organization is so important. because you're so involved in your project. The people around you are so involved with your project. I'm sure that you all have somebody that you trust who you could ask to read your applications. I mean, for me, I often get my mum to read things for me, and it's just things that I think are obvious, and she's just like, I really don't understand that. I don't get what you mean. And that is likely to be any trustee or kind of person assessing your grant. So just think about that, especially when you're not applying within the film world. And then the next thing is about accurate and realistic project budgets. So really making sure that you understand and can show how you come to your budget. So moving on to that, now there's definitely going to be a resource created about writing budgets. I know a lot of people find them confusing, and then it doesn't help that a lot of different organisations use slightly different templates and things. But here's just a general overview. So you want to start with the cost of your project. So that's your expenditure. So that is all your cost to deliver the project, including staff time. And now when you're thinking of a project cost, what sometimes happens is when you're applying for funding, you only start putting the funding in that relates to the grant you're asking. But you need to start with, and most funders will want to see the entire project cost, and then they can see where their bit of income comes in and just show how the rest of it works. And in terms of income, you need to divide that into two sections, confirmed and unconfirmed. So your confirmed funds are things you've already raised. So that might be that you have a bit of core funding that will you support some of the staff time. It could be that you already have a grant from somewhere else that is funding part of what you're doing. And it could be, you've got kind of a venue in-kind partnership that's helping with that as well. Your unconfirmed income includes your earned income, so your ticket sales, those types of things, plus the grant you're applying for. So it's very clear in your budget how much you're asking for and how that relates to the expenditure. And then the total income and expenditure figures should add up to the same figure. I mean, it's very important that your budget balances, basically. So the main things to think about when you're doing the budget as well is being really clear on how you've worked out your individual figures. So your budget commentary. So if you're talking about units of something, make it clear what those units are. So if you've got, I don't know, 6 units of this, is that an hour? Is that, just make sure that you've broken it down so that somebody looking at it who has no prior knowledge again knows what you're talking about. You also want to include a contingency. Kind of up to 5% is kind of usually what people accept. But depends on the size of the project, though, to be honest. And also just make sure it adds up, basically. We have all fallen foul of rogue, corrupt spreadsheet cells. So just make sure it does happen, especially if you've been working on a spreadsheet for a while. It's just one of those things. But yeah, just make sure it does add up properly and you've used the right sums. So just going to briefly say about the cultivation process, and stewardship is kind of the continuation of that. So you've had a fund, you want to keep updating people, and you want to keep them in the loop. You want them to fund you again. You want to continue to build those relationships. So it is the updating and the reporting, inviting them to events, and all those types of things. And I'm just going to talk before we end a little bit about reporting and monitoring, because sometimes I think it does get forgotten. But it is as important as the application for you, but also for your funders. It demonstrates the impact you've had. It gives you the chance to build more meaningful relationships with your audiences. You can really get to know them and understand the impact you're having, and gather those kind of compelling case studies. It's important that you factor in how you're going to do it properly from the beginning, and you gather your information throughout your project. But it builds relationship with funders as well. It demonstrates that you can be trusted. The likelihood of future grants from the same funders is massively increased. But the other thing is that funders talk to each other. If you don't do a final report, and even the Arts Council has quite a high number of people who don't do their final report, even though you don't get the final 10% of funding unless you kind of submit it. But funders, they do talk to each other. So if you're having a conversation, you haven't done a report, it might not only impact on your relationship with that funder, but with other funders as well. So it's very important to remember to get that information in as quickly as possible. Yeah, so I think now I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to look at some of your questions. I think Paul's going to join me again. So thank you. Oh, sorry, I've just seen about the freezing. Was that a massive issue for people?
Hi all. Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Saskia. Yeah, thanks, Ellen. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah, there's been a couple of issues with the audio, I think, but we will be sending around the recorded version, so you should be able to catch up on anything that you missed. Has anyone got any questions they want to put in the chat for us? I've just got one to kick off, which is a very practical one. The audio dropped out for Asher at the castle. You described one of the grant websites as the Grant Bible. Which one was that?
So that was actually, it wasn't the website. It was the Directory of Grant Making Trusts. This is it. So this is the tome that they publish every year. So it is published by the DCS, Directory of Social Change, and it literally divides by, you can search by geographic area, interest, and then at the end it just has a top overview of all the trusts, which you can then, if you want to go to their websites as well when they have them. But yeah, this is the one that they definitely have in the BFI Reuben Library and Westminster Library as well, and it is available to buy. But yeah. That's the Bible in my view.
Excellent, thank you. I had a question. Put questions in the chat if you can. If you've been turned down by a funder previously, is it worth reapplying or applying for a future round or a different fund from that funder?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends on why you were turned down. So I think hopefully you'll have had some feedback explaining the situation. And it may be, obviously some funders will tell you when they turn you down that you're more than happy for you to apply again. Some will have a gap, please don't apply again for a year. There are some funders out there who don't let you apply again for 3. But yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that you need to understand why you didn't get through. Sometimes it will just be one of those things. It will just be lots of competition. There's nothing wrong with your application. But sometimes it will be that you've not met the criteria of the fund. So when you're given feedback, and given that a lot of funders don't give feedback, when you have it, treasure it and use it and really understand what has been said, what the issue with your application was, and see if you can change things. It's definitely worth reapplying again, but you need to understand that if you put in exactly what you did before, you're not going to be successful. You need to talk about, if you can chat with somebody, that always helps as well, but just get that understanding really of what the issue was, what you need to improve, and absolutely try again. But do listen to what funders are saying. They're there to help you basically, although It may not always feel like that, but they are.
Great, thank you. We've had a flurry of questions now. Moira, if your work isn't public facing, does your sector count as your community?
Yes, good question, Moira. Until quite recently, the National Lottery Community Fund, as a good example here, were very much talking about a community as place-based, but they also recently redefined their criteria, and it's very much this idea of a community as absolutely the group you're working with, your community. So it's going to depend on the funder, to be honest. Some will have, obviously a community is a word that has quite a lot of connotations, so some funders will still be very traditional in how they approach that. But if you can make a case for why your work is with a community and why that community needs support, then it's definitely worth having those conversations. Yes.
Great. Evelyn, can you give advice on applying for funding during COVID? Obviously things, it's just popped up, it's gone away from me in the chat. Obviously things are uncertain, in-person events being able to take place. What happens if we apply and are successful for funding for in-person activities, but have to cancel and move online?
Yeah, so I mean, effectively, most funders who are funding in-person events should have guidance on this, and a lot of it is still in terms of timeline. So, you know, the Arts Council at the moment, and I suspect they will be revising their grants. Their kind of guidance is that up until the end of August, assume that you're probably not going to be doing in-person stuff, but if you are, really look at the risk management. I mean, obviously, it's such an unknown time. I think you have to plan. We have to plan for the best. But what is going to be important is the risk management. So, you know, if it can't happen, you just need to be able to show that you've thought about it. That, you know, you're really hoping it can, and you've kind of thought about all the kind of things that could derail it if you know, we went into another lockdown, or if, you know, we needed to have smaller capacity and all those types of things. And it's really about just showing that you know what the alternative is. Most funders, and in those circumstances, are not going to take that funding away from you, as long as, you know, you can still show that there's a progression. And if you're moving to online, you know, if that's the, you know, I don't anticipate the funders are going to suddenly become, you know, most of them have been very supportive over the last year, and I don't anticipate that that's going to change. But it is really thinking, you know, your kind of risk management, understanding how things, you know, if it gets cancelled, what would you do instead? Your plan B. Basically, you need to know what your plan B is, so that you can show that to people when you apply, so that they know you're thinking about it, and that will certainly help.
Great, thank you. Katie says we're not registered as a not-for-profit, although we are basically a break-even festival annually. Our sponsor model has changed dramatically, but government grants have helped sustain this year. Next year, we'll need to refocus. Have you got any tips on where to start looking for further support?
Yeah, so it is a difficult one when you are not a registered nonprofit in some way. So it might be that you want to look at potentially some of the community interest company models, just because a lot of funders will just not touch you effectively. So I think it's maybe looking back at, you know, I would start with that, looking at, you know, what it is you want to achieve and what model works best for you to do that. There are some things, some of the government funding, you don't have to be, and it really depends, you know. There's this kind of also definition of community groups again that we come back to, whereas some of the funders, depending on your size, might decide that you fit into their criteria as community groups. But to be honest, I mean, even as a CIC, you know, there are a lot of funders out there who will not fund anybody apart from a charity. So it's just worth bearing that in mind, really, that as you're kind of looking at fundraising strategies, looking at your organizational structure is a place that you do need to think about what opportunities are available to you, you know, because of who you are and what limits you have and what might work best for you, basically, going forward. Great,
thank you. Victor asks, do you have any recommendations on when to approach BFI Audience Fund?
Well, I think that might be a question for you, Paul.
Yeah, well, the audience fund is open. I don't know if there's necessarily any kind of recommendations on when to apply for the BFI audience fund. To be honest,
when you're ready, I would say. When you're ready, when your project is ready.
There you go. When you're ready. And you know, the guidelines are there on how, you know, obviously it's different from the funding that is available from the hubs, which is the Fan Film Exhibition Fund, which is currently open. It's larger amounts, and it's generally for activity that is more nationally focused. So you need to make sure that you're addressing those kind of criteria. But, you know, I would advise that you get in touch with the BFI and have a chat about what you might be thinking about doing, and take it from there.
Yeah, I'd second that. That, you know, they're a very open team, and yeah, they'll definitely talk to you if you know, and the guidance on the website is, you know, is very clear actually. So yeah. But as I say, just if you can't, again, going back to the kind of case for support thing, if you can't answer those type of key questions, you know, there is a lot of demand for the audience fund. So you just need to make sure that you know what you're doing and why and where, because as I say, the national focus is very important.
Yeah, and if you are struggling to get any information on the Audience Fund, you know, we are here at the Hub and are very, very happy to talk through what you might be thinking about. You know, obviously it's not our fund, so you know, it's better to talk direct to the BFI, but happy to kind of you know, be here to talk through any ideas you might have and hopefully help develop that if that's helpful. Any other questions coming through? If not, I think we will wrap it up there. Thank you, Ellen. That was fantastic. I really appreciate it. It was great. We're going to be circulating Ellen's slides, and we'll also be circulating Ellen's email address, so you can get in touch with any questions afterwards.
Presentation.
Yeah. So yeah, so now before we go into the virtual networking room, thank you very much, Ellen. Just a quick update from us at Film Hub London. We have got the Fan Film Exhibition Fund open, which I mentioned earlier. So check out the Film Hub London website for the guidelines on that. You can also get in touch with Steffi or myself, and we'll be happy to talk through the fund and get an application in for that. Other funds are open. The New Directions Fund is open, which is run by Film Hub North as the lead for Screen Heritage for FAN. New Directions is a program supporting archive film events which retrace historic steps that have brought the UK to its current political and cultural crossroads. National projects of £15,000. The deadline for those is the 16th of July, so you've got a couple of days to get that one in. Otherwise, one-off projects with the £10,000 limit, the deadline is the 10th of September, so that's a good way to spend the summer. To find out more, check out the Film Hub North website. Also, just to reiterate that we have fan advice sessions available. Ellen is one of the advisors on the fan advice session, so you can get in touch and book a fan advice session through that for either fundraising or a variety of other specialisms that are available. And just that Film Hub London also has training and travel bursaries open and available. And I think that's about it from us. I will, well, we will now open up this virtual toucan space for you to network. I think you've probably worked it all out by now, but you just hover over your target and click join, and then you can have a chat. Okay, well, I'll let you go. Thanks very much. Good luck with all your funding bibs. Enjoy a cinema-filled summer, and hopefully we'll be back in the autumn in the real world. Thanks very much. Thanks, Ellen.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to see you all. Bye.